I've seen my fair share of drama. Serving in the Coast Guard for over 2 decades will do that to a person. But I never expected my biggest battle on dry land would be right here in my own neighborhood. Picture it. A crisp Saturday morning, the sun casting long shadows on the driveway, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen. I remember it all so clearly because that morning everything changed. That was the day I realized I was dealing with a real piece of work. A woman who ran the homeowners association like she was some kind of feudal lord. Or, as folks around here like to call her, HOA Karen. Before I get into the details, let me just say that I'm no stranger to following rules. It's hardwired into me from my days aboard cutters and station assignments along the coastline. That sense of order, chain of command, and respect for protocol had guided me for years. When I retired from the Coast Guard, I thought a quiet suburban neighborhood would be a nice place to settle, fish, and do my mechanical tinkering in peace. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA, especially one with a president who believes her word is law, then you know how quickly quiet can turn into confrontational. That Saturday, I was performing my usual routine, finishing up coffee at the dining room table while scanning headlines, mentally preparing a grocery list for the week. My wife, Diane, was humming an old Billy Joel tune in the kitchen as she rinsed dishes. The day was off to a good start until I saw the tow truck. Now, I'd anticipated a showdown with the HOA eventually. For weeks, they'd been sending me letters about my boat being stored improperly. The boat in question is my pride and joy, a 22-foot center console I'd named the Mariner's Friend. She's not huge, but she's more than enough for fishing trips around the bay. I kept her in my driveway on a custom trailer, tucked neatly, with a heavy tarp strapped down to protect from the elements. HOA guidelines did say something about no watercraft visible from the street, but half the time, folks left their speedboats on driveways or parked jet skis along the side yards. You could walk down the block and see at least 3 or 4 watercraft at any given time. It seemed petty to single mine out, but singled out I was. And right then, from my living room window, I saw the dreaded tow truck hooking up to my boat trailer. My heart thundered in my chest. I slammed down my coffee mug, spilling half of it across the table, and sprinted outside. I caught just a glimpse of a figure in a tennis visor, arms folded across her chest, standing at the edge of my lawn like she was the general of some personal army. Karen. She didn't waste a second. "You've had plenty of warnings," she called over as soon as I stepped into view. "The HOA has issued repeated violations regarding that eyesore." Eyesore? I marched over, doing my best to keep my temper in check. "Ma'am, you can't just have a tow company haul away my personal property. This is theft." Karen rolled her eyes. "Now, let's be civilized here. The board voted that your boat is in violation of neighborhood aesthetics. It's blocking the view of the street, lowering property values, and you're lowering property values, messing with my property, telling me how to live." I barked, yanking out my phone to snap pictures of the tow truck hooking up the trailer. The driver shrugged at me in the rearview mirror, as if to say, "I'm just doing my job." Karen took a measured step closer, her pastel tennis skirt swishing around her knees. "Don't be dramatic. I followed the rules. Gave you official notices. You refused to comply. So now the association is exercising its right to remove the offending article, especially as your dues are in arrears." Dues in arrears? That was news to me. I had checks going out automatically every quarter. The idea that I was behind was outrageous. I gritted my teeth. "I'm not behind on anything, and you don't have the authority to do this. A quick check with the board says otherwise." She shook her head, a faint grin spreading across her face. "You'll have to address any disputes at our next monthly meeting. In the meantime, the boat is coming with me." I don't know whom he was, because she certainly wasn't hitching it to her own car. The tow truck driver was finishing the final connections, and with a groan of metal, my precious boat began rolling away from my driveway. I glanced at the side of the truck to see if it belonged to a reputable towing company. It had a local tow yard logo, but that didn't stop the wave of helplessness and anger washing over me. The driver was heading off with my boat, ignoring my attempts to wave him down. Karen gave me a parting shot. "If you want it back, you'll be paying all the fines." And who knows if the boat will pass an inspection afterward. She turned to walk away, but I caught her last words. Next time, maybe you'll think twice before breaking HOA guidelines. I stood on my lawn, fists clenched, my jaw set in a hard line. In the Coast Guard, you learn to remain calm under pressure. Life or death situations demand it. But no one had trained me how to handle a petty tyrant operating under the guise of an HOA rulebook. My wife jogged out of the house, flustered, eyes wide as the tow truck disappeared down the street. "Where are they taking it?" she asked, alarmed. I didn't have a clue yet, but I did know one thing. I wasn't going to let this pass. Karen might think she had the upper hand with her fancy legalese and rulebook jargon, but she just made the worst mistake of her life. She'd stolen from a seasoned serviceman who knew more than his fair share about maritime law, property rights, and how to navigate a bureaucracy. I would get my boat back, and I'd see to it that Karen learned a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. I spent the rest of that Saturday making phone calls to get to the bottom of the HOA fiasco. First, I dialed my bank to verify the payments for my HOA dues. As I suspected, everything was up to date. The friendly lady on the other end even verified that the last check had cleared over a week before. So if Karen and her cronies were claiming I was delinquent, something fishy was going on. My next call was to a friend of mine, Logan, who happened to be a local attorney. Logan was one of those folks who loved the challenge of going toe-to-toe with petty authoritarian groups, especially HOAs. Whenever we'd have a beer together, he'd spin epic tales about litigious neighbors feuding over fence heights or mailbox colors. So when I told him about my boat being towed, he jumped right into legal mode. "That's definitely not standard," Logan said. "First, an HOA can't just declare you're in violation without giving you official notice and time to address it. Even if they argue you've been warned, they have to follow due process, especially if you're not actually delinquent on dues. And towing your personal property from your driveway? That's borderline theft." I exhaled. That's exactly what I was thinking. Karen claims a board vote gave them the right. She also called my boat an eyesore. I need to figure out how I can get it back immediately. It's not like a car that was illegally parked on city property. This was my driveway. Logan gave a low whistle. "We can file a complaint with the local police, but they'll likely say it's a civil matter. However, it could still help document the situation. Maybe put some pressure on the HOA. Also, check the towing company. They might hold your boat at their yard. Pay attention to any daily storage fees. That can add up fast." "Will do," I said, pacing the kitchen. My wife, arms folded, stood in the doorway, listening intently. After hanging up, I dialed the number on the towing company's website. The dispatcher was friendly enough, but insisted they were acting on an order from the HOA president. She informed me my boat was being held in their secure impound lot, accruing daily fees. My blood pressure spiked. When I asked what paperwork the HOA provided, she mentioned a stack of forms claiming I owed unpaid dues and a list of community violations. I requested copies. She said I'd have to visit their office on Monday. The rest of the weekend, I wrestled with anger and something else, a sense of betrayal. I'd chosen this neighborhood because it looked like the American dream. Houses with tidy lawns, a short drive to the water, neighbors who waved hello while walking their dogs. The sense of belonging had drawn me in. But now I felt naive for not seeing the signs that there was a woman behind the curtain pulling strings, forcing everyone to tiptoe around her demands. If she could do this to me, what was she doing to the more timid folks on the block? On Sunday morning, I decided to do a little detective work of my own. I went out for a jog around the neighborhood, greeting everyone I passed with a nod. Then I pulled aside a neighbor who'd also been singled out by the HOA before. His name was Douglas, an older gentleman with a wise, weathered face. He was tending to his flower beds, wearing muddy gardening gloves. "Doug," I asked, leaning on his white picket fence, "have you ever heard of an HOA forcibly towing someone's property from their own driveway?" He paused, eyes wide. "That's extreme. I've heard rumors Karen tries to clamp down on things that offend her sensibilities, but towing a boat? Never seen anything like that." I explained the situation. He winced as if in pain. "That's messed up. You know, you're not the only one who's had run-ins with her. She's been giving me grief about my rose bushes, saying I planted them 6 inches too close to the sidewalk. She threatened a fine if I don't dig them up. He shook his head in frustration. There's a rumor going around that Karen's trying to run for some local council seat next year. She's using the HOA presidency to build her resume or something. One thing's for sure, she's stepping on toes left and right. I thanked him for the info and continued on my jog, my mind buzzing. If Karen's overreaching was part of a larger plan, like climbing the political ladder, she might do anything to keep her record pristine. Dealing with a lawsuit or paying me restitution might not fit into her aspirational blueprint. That meant I had leverage if I played my cards right. She thought towing my boat was a simple power play, but she hadn't anticipated that I have a knack for strategy, honed by years of maritime and logistic planning. Sunday afternoon, I drafted an email to the HOA board, demanding the immediate return of my property. I also cited a few references to local statutes regarding personal property and towing. Nothing too intense, just enough to show I wasn't going to be bullied. Diane hovered over my shoulder, reading along. Make sure you mention your service background, she suggested. Sometimes people understand that you know a thing or two about regulations when they realize you served. I hesitated, but took her advice, subtly referencing my Coast Guard experience without sounding threatening. I didn't want to wave a big stick around or brag. But maybe, just maybe, letting them know I was intimately familiar with maritime law would scare them into compliance. I clicked send, half expecting a quick response. None came. By Monday morning, my frustration had transformed into a quiet fury and determination. I would get my boat back that day, or at least I would start the chain reaction that would force Karen to return it. Part of me, the part shaped by the uniform, wanted to handle this peacefully, following the rules. Another part, the rebellious side I rarely used, wanted to march into the HOA office and read Karen the Riot Act. But I learned over the years that a cool head usually wins out over fiery words. So I put on my best button-down shirt and slacks, looking less like a disgruntled neighbor and more like a professional man with important business. I stood in the hallway mirror, smoothing my collar, while Diane adjusted my tie. I had a plan. First, I'd visit the towing company to collect any evidence or forms they had. Then I'd swing by City Hall to clarify the local ordinances regarding HOAs and towing. And if time permitted, I'd pop into the local police station, at least to get my complaint on record. If Karen wanted a war, she'd get one. But this war was going to be fought by the book, with the meticulous patience that had saved me on stormy seas and impossible missions. Little did she know, she was up against someone who thrived on tough challenges. As I walked out the door, a memory flashed through my mind, my first time intercepting smugglers off the Gulf Coast. We were outnumbered and had to rely on quick thinking rather than brute force. That sense of mission, that drive to protect what's right, came flooding back. This was a different kind of mission, sure, but I was no less committed. Karen might not know it yet, but she'd picked a fight with the wrong man. I arrived at the towing company's impound lot, a dusty fenced compound on the outskirts of town, a little after 9 in the morning. Rows of cars and a couple of battered RVs sat behind the chain link barrier. Sure enough, parked in the far corner, was the Mariner's Friend, my beloved boat, still on its trailer. My stomach lurched in a mix of relief at seeing her and anger at the indignity of her captivity. Inside the cramped office, a lone employee sat behind a counter, munching on a breakfast sandwich. He glanced up, recognized me from Saturday, and offered a quick nod. "Morning. Here for the boat." I controlled my temper, putting on a polite smile. "That's right. I spoke to someone this weekend who said I'd have to pay a fine and storage fees. I'd like to see the paperwork that authorized you to take it in the first place." He grunted, set down his sandwich, and rifled through a file drawer. Eventually, he produced a packet of papers. It had the HOA's letterhead, Karen's signature, and something about multiple infractions. I skimmed it, noting how vague it was. There was a single line mentioning overdue HOA fees, no proof or reference number, and a list of neighborhood rule violations. My eyes narrowed. This was thin evidence at best. "I'd like to get it released," I said, returning the papers. "We both know the towing's probably questionable, but I'm not here to argue with you." The employee shrugged. "Look, I just follow orders. If the HOA has a contract with us, we tow what they say. If you want a boat back, you gotta settle up. He tapped the corner of the desk. $300 for the tow, plus 75 a day for storage. That's 1 day so far. Makes it $375 total. I ground my teeth. The principle of paying for something I never should have been charged for to begin with gnawed at me. But if I refused, that boat would stay here and rack up more fees. I could eventually win a court battle, but the boat might rot in the impound yard for who knows how long. I needed it back now. Resentfully, I pulled out my wallet and handed over a credit card. The employee rang me up, printed a receipt, and directed me to the gate. I try not to think about the injustice of it all as I led my boat out of the lot, hooking it up to my truck. Anger burned in my gut, but I shoved it aside for the time being. My top priority was ensuring the mariner's friend got home safe. Then I'd confront the HOA again, or maybe escalate it legally. As I drove, I mulled over the irony. I was a Coast Guard veteran, no stranger to enforcement actions on the high seas, inspecting vessels, checking for contraband, upholding maritime law. Yet here I was on land, being bullied by the very kind of bureaucratic nonsense I'd spent a career cutting through. Well, not for long. Instead of going straight home, I swung by City Hall. The building was a squat, modern structure with tan brick and a large glass entrance. Inside, after a bit of bouncing around from department to department, I ended up speaking to a clerk who handled HOA registrations and compliance. She was sympathetic, but explained the city generally let HOAs govern themselves. She did, however, mention that HOAs are subject to state property laws. If they overstep, they can be challenged in court. She also recommended I file a formal complaint through the city's Consumer Protection Office. Another layer of paperwork, but it might help. By noon, I was in the local police station. The desk officer looked bored until I explained I was there to report an unauthorized towing of personal property. I offered the documents I'd collected. He scribbled notes, occasionally raising an eyebrow at the mention of overdue dues and eyesore boat. Then he gave me a little half-smile. Sounds like you've got a real situation on your hands. HOA folks can be a headache sometimes. I'll file this, but you might not see immediate action from us. This is usually civil. Still, it's good to get on the record. That was all I could do at the moment. So I drove home, boat in tow. A few neighbors watched curiously as I backed it into my driveway. This time, I decided to keep the boat unhooked from the trailer hitch and nestled it behind the side gate, barely visible from the street. I wasn't about to let them take it again without a fight. I spent the rest of the afternoon on calls, first to my attorney friend Logan, updating him, then with a few neighbors who'd had their own run-ins with Karen. Turns out, she'd orchestrated fines for everything from a slightly crooked mailbox to a child's bicycle left on the lawn. Her reign of terror had been going on for months, maybe even years, but most folks just paid the fines, not wanting to escalate. Now, though, hearing that she'd actually gone so far as to tow my boat, they were rattled, and a handful were willing to band together to challenge her. We arranged an impromptu meeting at my place that evening. 5 neighbors showed up, all with their own stories of Karen's overreach. One woman talked about how Karen claimed a vintage birdbath in her yard was unapproved landscaping. Another gentleman described how Karen singled him out for painting his garage door an HOA-approved color, but one shade off. She forced him to repaint it on his own dime. Everyone seemed both angry and resigned, like they felt powerless. Well, I said, clearing my throat, there's power in numbers. We can vote out the HOA board if we get enough neighbors on our side, right? They nodded, glancing at each other uncertainly. Karen's got a small but vocal group, someone pointed out. She's friends with the previous president. The board is basically her clique. They push their agendas through without letting the rest of us speak. And a lot of people are too busy or intimidated to show up at meetings. I exchanged a glance with Diane, who was refilling coffee cups around our dining room table. My mind flicked back to how I used to organize rescue operations at sea. It always started with the right plan, the right team, and unwavering determination. Folks, I've dealt with tougher adversaries on the open water, I said. Karen might have her rules on her side, but rules can be interpreted. If we work together, we might be able to push back. But we've got to do it in a professional way. No name-calling, no fighting dirty. Trust me, the best way is to follow the chain of command. She's used to people cowering or not showing up. That won't be us. Some of them seemed intrigued, others skeptical. But as the night wore on, we hammered out a plan. Gather more neighbors, share stories, and show up to the next HOA meeting en masse. If necessary, we'd move to impeach or recall Karen if that was allowed in the bylaws. It wasn't exactly an overnight fix, but it was a start. When everyone left, I felt lighter, like the weight of the day had lifted slightly. Diane gave me a tired smile. "You're always happiest when you're protecting people," she said, leaning in for a gentle hug. I realized she was right. It was in my blood, and now that my neighbors were relying on me, I was fully committed. Karen wanted a battle? I was going to give her one by the books, with a well-organized neighborhood force behind me. She'd messed with the wrong boat, and more importantly, with the wrong Coast Guard veteran. The next HOA meeting was held in the community center, a squat, beige building with harsh fluorescent lighting that hummed overhead. For most of the year I'd lived here, these meetings had been small, barely attended. But tonight was different. Word spread fast about Karen's latest stunt, and dozens of residents packed the folding chairs. Whispers filled the room. "I can't believe she towed his boat. She'll be sorry now." Karen sat at the front on a slightly raised platform, flanked by two board members who looked like her personal entourage. She wore her usual pastel cardigan and a self-assured smirk. When the clock hit 7, she tapped a gavel against the wooden podium. "Order," she said, scanning the crowd. "We have a busy agenda. Thank you all for coming." She breezed through a few housekeeping items, carefully avoiding eye contact with me as I waited in the front row. My neighbors who joined me, plus several new faces, sat strategically throughout the audience. We'd prep a statement and were ready to speak when the time came. After about 30 minutes of tedious talk about landscaping budgets and community event planning, the meeting reached the open floor portion. That's when I stood up. "My name is John Ripley," I announced, voice carrying in the stillness of the room. "I'd like to address a recent situation in which my personal property, a legally owned and registered fishing boat, was towed from my driveway without my knowledge or permission." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's eyes flicked to me, then down to her papers, as if bored. "Yes, Mr. Ripley," she said, tapping her pen on the agenda. "We've received your emails. You were in violation of HOA guidelines regarding watercraft." With calm precision, I held up the paperwork from the towing company and the bank statements confirming my HOA dues were current. Not only was I not delinquent on my dues, but the boat was parked on my private driveway, well within the property line. The guidelines you refer to are broad and have not been uniformly enforced. Many neighbors keep boats and recreational vehicles visible from the street. Why was I singled out? A few supportive yes echoed in the room. Karen frowned. "We have photographic evidence of your boat overshadowing the curb," she said, but she didn't produce any actual photos. "It obstructed the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and you've been sent repeated notices about this, none of which specified towing would occur without further due process." I countered, my tone firm but measured. I reached out to local authorities and legal counsel, who believed this action was out of line. "Neighbors, if this could happen to me, it could happen to any of you. Are we comfortable allowing one person to dictate how we live, seize our property, and impose arbitrary fines?" The murmurs grew louder. A few folks openly glared at Karen. One older woman stood up. "I got a fine for planting sunflowers in my front yard." "Sunflowers?" Karen said they were too tall. Another man waved his hand in the air, demanding to speak. People started to realize the pattern of harassment and intimidation. Karen cleared her throat and banged the gavel again. "This is out of order. These are sensitive matters best handled privately. The board has the authority to address violations as it sees fit. If you have a complaint, you should file it according to proper procedure." That was the moment I'd been waiting for. "And that's exactly what we've done," I said, voice ringing with conviction. "I have a stack of signed complaints from over 30 residents here, requesting a formal review of your conduct as HOA president. We're invoking the bylaw that allows members to motion for a special vote on your leadership. We want a recall." Karen's confident facade cracked for just a moment. She looked at the two board members beside her, who seemed equally stunned. In the back, a chorus of "hear, hear" resonated. She swallowed hard. You can't just... There's a process for that. I held up the bylaws, neatly highlighted in certain sections. We follow that process. We have a required number of signatures to request an immediate membership vote, which should occur at the earliest possible convenience, per the official HOA guidelines. The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. Karen realized she was cornered. She attempted to argue, flipping through her own copy of the bylaws, but the crowd's reaction was clear. They wanted accountability. They'd had enough. A voice from the middle of the room piped up. Why do we need to wait? We're all here. People started clapping, stomping their feet. I saw a few board members exchange uneasy glances. They might have been in Karen's pocket before, but now they were sensing a shift in the wind. Sticking with her could sink them, too. Karen glared at me like I'd committed a crime. Fine, she spat. A motion has been made. Any second. She gave a bitter laugh, but multiple hands shot into the air. From there, the next hour was a dizzying display of democracy in action. People stepped forward, told their stories, and expressed disapproval of Karen's bullying tactics. The board's lawyer, who'd been quietly lurking at the side, tried to intervene, advising they needed a separate meeting for an official vote. But the membership insisted on an immediate poll. Even if it was preliminary, it was clear where everyone stood. Finally, someone called for the recall. The board was forced to count raised hands. Dozens shot up to remove her. A few of her loyalists, about 7 or 8, voted to keep her in place. It wasn't even close. The recall passed in principle, pending an official final vote. Karen looked mortified, cheeks bright red, her posture rigid. As I stood there, relief and gratitude swept over me. I had joined a fight I never wanted, but I did it for my property, my neighbors, and the principle of fair treatment. Karen learned tonight that no amount of intimidation can stand against a community that unites in defense of what's right. In a last-ditch effort to save face, Karen mumbled something about legal repercussions for the boat incident, but no one paid her much attention. The meeting adjourned in a wave of chatter and excitement. I was swamped by neighbors patting my shoulder, thanking me for taking a stand. We all knew the final official vote would seal Karen's fate, but she was effectively dethroned. Before I left, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing at the edge of the room, clutching her stack of papers, staring daggers at me. Maybe she finally realized the truth. Not only had she illegally towed a Coast Guard veteran's boat, but she had awakened a sense of unity among the neighborhood. Gone was the complacency that let her reign run unchecked. I walked outside into the cool evening air. My boat was safe at home, my name cleared, and soon we'd have a new HOA president who, hopefully, would do their job without turning the neighborhood into a personal fiefdom. Diane slipped her hand into mine, a gentle squeeze telling me how proud she was. I inhaled, feeling the weight roll off my shoulders. In the distance, beyond the dimly lit houses, I thought I heard the faint rush of water from the bay. It reminded me of the reason I'd chosen to live here in the first place. Proximity to the coast, a peaceful environment to enjoy life after service. And after this little fiasco, maybe that peace was finally within reach. Karen had underestimated me, but she'd also underestimated the neighborhood's power when it worked together. She believed she was untouchable, but she discovered the hard way that sometimes the person you're messing with has spent a career battling storms, pirates, and traffickers on the open seas. Compared to that, an overzealous HOA president was just a small squall, a storm that I, along with my neighbors, had swiftly navigated to safer waters. And, in the end, the tide turned in our favor. The end.